something very significant is happening in the UK economy, and it's not for the better. The cost of borrowing has now increased. Investors are now losing confidence in the UK government and the UK economy, and they're now appearing to be unwilling to lend the government money unless they get an extremely high rate of return. The pound has shot to the lowest level in 14 months, and economic growth has been close to zero over the last 6 months of this Labour government. So, what does that mean for us here at home, and what does it mean for the UK economy as a whole? Well, we'll take a look at all of this. We'll see what's happening with the cost of borrowing, what's happening with the bonds, why the national debt is now spiralling out of control, and what actions the UK government can potentially take to try and save themselves from being dominated and controlled by the financial markets. So we'll take a look at all of this, but before we do, it takes just 2 seconds. If you're new around here and you enjoy this video, please do consider hitting the like and subscribe button down below. And without further ado, let's get into it. So, what is going on? Well, bond yields have now risen to their highest level since 1998. And this essentially is the way that the government borrows money. So, when a government wants to borrow money to spend it, they issue a bond in exchange for cash, and then they use that cash to fund projects like building schools, hospitals, roads, etc. It's essentially an IOU. Now, what's happening in the UK at the minute is that the price of bonds is going down because investors or mutual fund managers, they're now selling all their UK bonds. And why? Because they're losing confidence in the UK government and the UK economy. Essentially, they don't trust the UK government and the UK economy to pay them the money back. Whatever money they invest into the bond, they don't think they can get it back. Meaning, they're getting rid of the bonds while they still can. Now, this spells very bad news for the UK government because their plan is to significantly increase the number of bonds they issue over the next 5 years. However, if the yield rates are now also increasing, then that means the cost to the government for issuing those bonds and borrowing the money has also increased. Let's say, for example, you invested £100 into a 1-year bond, and the rate of that bond was 5%. So, you invested £100, at the end of a year, you get back your original £100, also known as the face value, and you get back 5% of the investment on top. So, you invested £100, you get back £100 and an extra £5 on top. So you're £5 better off. Now, let's say for example the rate was 6%. You invested £100, you get back the £100, and you get back an extra £6 on top. Now, for you as an investor that would be good, but for the UK government it's a higher cost that they incur because the extra cost they have to pay back has significantly increased. It's gone from 5 to 6. So now they're having to pay back more money. And that is where the cost of borrowing increases. But hang on a second. You would think that if you have a higher yield rate, investors can get more money back from the bond. So surely they would want to buy those bonds, right? Not exactly. As mentioned at the start of this video, the pound sterling has fallen to the lowest level in 14 months. So investors will now be looking at this thinking, hang on a second, we could be losing value on our investment here. If the UK economy is struggling and the pound sterling doesn't rise, it keeps falling, then we could be losing the value of our bonds, which means we need to make the decision to sell the bond now. That is what's happening in the UK at the minute. So regardless of a higher yield rate, the thing that trumps everything at the minute is the concern that investors and lenders have in the UK economy. It all comes back down to that one common denominator. It's the economy. So let's talk about GDP and the current state of the UK economy today. July of 2024 is when the new government came to power. So, if we look at August, we had a bit of economic growth of 0.2% in GDP. But in September and October, the economy shrunk. It contracted. Basically, it achieved negative economic growth. And in both September and October, you can see here, minus 0.1% in September, minus 0.1% in October. Doesn't spell good news for GDP if the economy is shrinking. And it's being reported that this could very well continue going into 2025, with UK economic growth continuing to lag expectations in the new year. So this is a very bad time for the UK. Not just for the economy, I mean, we've seen what's happened there with negative GDP growth. I mean, God forbid, if that continues, then the UK will end up in a recession. But it's also particularly damaging for the UK governments, because if, as we've discussed before, as the borrowing costs have increased, if the government is unable to borrow as much money as they need through the issuing of selling new bonds, then they're either going to have to find another way to raise the money to spend on infrastructure, medical, healthcare, all that kind of stuff, or they're going to need to cut spending altogether. So either way, it's going to be a very unpopular situation, because if they end up going down raising taxes more than they already have, then they're going to be seen as more unpopular than they are today with the great British public. I mean, for a government that's already hanging on, desperately hanging on, and is seen as massively unpopular already, if they then go about raising taxes more on the average working man and woman, then it could very well end the Keir Starmer-Rachel Reeves governments. And equally, if they decide to put in place a whole wave of spending cuts and impose a new age of austerity, similar to what the Conservative government of the past did, then equally, that will be seen as unpopular as raising taxes. And as such, either way, it could very well spell the end of the Starmer-Reeves governments. Now, of course, this isn't me. I'm not a fortune teller. I'm not a qualified psychic. I can't see into the future. But it's one of those things where either way, you can't really see a way out for the governments. Because how on earth are they going to continue funding their investment projects and raise the money to do so if the cost of borrowing has increased and they're now having to look elsewhere? They're having to turn to the taxpayer to say, give us more of your money. That just won't work. But don't forget, even raising taxes may not be an option going forward, because if more businesses go under and more people end up out of work, then you have fewer employed people to tax and fewer businesses to tax. At that point, you then have to increase the taxes on the businesses that are left and the people that are left in employment, eventually squeezing them out of employment and out of business as well. So you end up in a never-ending merry-go-round of economic decline. So, in conclusion, if we continue seeing the cost of borrowing increase because fund managers and investors are continuing to sell off the UK bonds, and as Labour have promised, well, I say promised loosely, Labour have said that they do not want to increase taxes more than they have now, then realistically, we will be returning to austerity. We will start to see spending cuts in vast areas of public investments. And that, in turn, while the government will argue that it's necessary, it will very well be damaging for the economy. If you can't invest in the UK economy, then you can't expect to grow the UK economy. Realistically, it can go one of two ways. Either the markets calm down, investors calm down, the cost of borrowing comes down, and that allows Rachel Reeves and the government time to get a plan in place before making their next move in March. Or the markets could continue to come down, bonds could continue to be sold, the cost of borrowing could continue to increase, forcing the government to make an emergency statement on cuts in government spending. But either way, it most likely means austerity. But let's wait and see. In the short term, let's see if the bond sell-off rate starts to reduce and calm down a bit. And in the long term, let's wait and see what the latest GDP figures look like, because that'll give us a much better indicator where the UK is headed going into 2025. But for now, it's a waiting game. But until then, thank you all for watching. Please do consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed this video. Drop a comment down below. Let me know your thoughts on the situation. Where do you think the UK is going to go going into 2025? I'd love to hear from you. And until the next time, see you all later and take care.